Ohio, and we're happy to be hosting the third meeting of the Social Determinants of Infant Mortality Advisory Group via webinar today. Just a reminder that this call and webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the project website. Just to remind everyone, you can get to the project website through our website, which is hpio.net, and then click on the Projects tab, and you'll see this advisory group listed. The slides from today will also be posted on that page as well. Okay, the objectives for today's meeting are to provide an update on the project overall, and then to prepare for the October 17th meeting, which will be the fourth and final meeting of this advisory group. In terms of preparation, we're going to discuss Ohio's policymaking environment in order to be able to craft realistic and effective policy recommendations. We're going to talk about different types of policy levers we might consider as we're formulating policy recommendations. And then last, talk about how research evidence will be used to inform policy recommendations in this project. As I mentioned, the last advisory group meeting will take place on October 17th from 9 to noon. It'll be an in-person meeting here in Columbus. We have not identified the meeting location yet, but we will do so shortly and let you all know where that will be. I'll just add too, if you happen to be from the Columbus area and have access to or know of any free or very low-cost meeting sites and would like to offer those up to us, we'd be very appreciative. This advisory group is much larger than we had originally anticipated, which is terrific. We've had great turnout, which is terrific. That has presented some challenges because apparently October 17th is going to be a very busy day here in Columbus, and every potential free or low-cost site that we can think of has been already reserved. So if you can help out on that, we'd appreciate it. So now I'm going to hand it off to Amy Bush-Stevens to provide an update on the project to date.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be talking about our progress on the timeline so far and the deliverables for this project. Follow up from the August advisory group meeting that we had at the food bank, and then do a quick update on the most improved states research that we've been doing. As a quick reminder, these are the requirements from Senate Bill 332 for the components of this study. And this is where we are in the timeline. You'll notice that every time we share this slide, we're getting a little bit closer to that December 1st deadline. These are some pictures from the advisory group meeting that we had at the food bank, and so we want to thank everybody who was able to attend that meeting. We had about 70 people participating, so we had really productive small group discussions that are really helping us to shape the final report. And it was really great to hear a variety of perspectives from a wide range of organizations from many different parts of the state. So for us in Columbus, it's always helpful to hear those perspectives from the local level. So that was great. And one suggestion that we heard from the group was the importance of including some qualitative information in the final report to supplement all of the quantitative information that we'll be including. So some stories or real-life examples of the challenges that we're highlighting, particularly related to housing, transportation, education, and employment. So you should have received an email from me where I sent out a plea asking for these types of stories and examples, and a few of you have sent things back, but I'd like to ask again in case there are some other things that folks can send in. So we're looking for things like summary reports, quotes, or case studies from qualitative needs assessments that you may have done. For example, if you've done some focus groups or community forums or neighborhood walk audits, or maybe photos that illustrate challenges in your community related to transportation or housing, or one of those other factors. So one of the things that we did at the meeting in August was to review the 4 pathways diagrams and the narratives that accompany those diagrams. And so we're in the process of revising those to reflect the suggestions that we got in those small groups. And we here at HPIO, we're building our knowledge on housing, transportation, education, and employment. So we really appreciated having the opportunity to learn from some experts in those fields to help us revise these diagrams. Another suggestion that we heard in the small groups that we needed a summary pathway diagram that brought all of the information together across the 4 topics, and that also calls out poverty and racism in particular as underlying drivers of the challenges and inequities that we talk about in each of these diagrams. So this is a draft of that summary diagram. And now I'm just going to share a little bit about the most improved states research. So these are the 8 case study states that we've been reaching out to. And quick reminder on how we narrowed down. We took a look at trend data for overall infant mortality, Black infant mortality, and the Black-white disparity, and narrowed it down to these 8 states. We've already conducted several interviews with contacts in these states, starting out by reaching out to the state departments of health, March of Dimes contacts, and minority health contacts. And then we're also continuing to reach out to experts in social determinants of health in those states as well. A few themes have already started to emerge from these interviews, and so we wanted to share a few highlights with you. We've heard in some of the interviews that having strong leadership from the governor has been important in some states. This is an example from South Carolina, where the administration of former Governor Nikki Haley put an emphasis on infant mortality reduction, including expansions of home visiting, specifically the nurse-family partnership model. And some of you may be familiar with the Pay for Success or social impact bond model that South Carolina is doing to support the nurse-family partnership. This is an example from Michigan. In the interview, we heard about how Governor Snyder there has a data dashboard that he refers to frequently. And so his administration has focused on the importance of metrics, and the dashboard includes infant mortality, and this has been his way of bringing attention to the issue. And then in Tennessee, what we heard about from folks there is that their governors in recent years, Governor Bredesen and now Governor Haslam, have had a really strong focus on access to higher education, and they have seen increases in educational attainment in Tennessee. And so this is an example of a few of the strategies, starting with the HOPE scholarship, and then they've added some additional policies and programs in recent years, including the Tennessee Promise. For the rest of this call, we're going to be talking about policy recommendations, because that will be an important part of the final report. Here's the process that we'll be using to develop the policy recommendations in the report. And we've already done this first step, which was to gather policy ideas from the literature reviews and the small group discussions at the August meeting. And now we're in the process of creating evidence inventories of evidence-based policies and programs for housing, transportation, education, and employment. And we'll be sharing that information out to you before the October 17th meeting so that you can draw upon it as you're thinking of policy recommendation ideas and then prioritizing the recommendations. At the October meeting, we'll be looking to you to help us refine those recommendations and then getting a sense of what's most important. Here's a draft list of the criteria for prioritizing the recommendations, and we're going to be working with the steering committee to finalize this list. Now we're going to transition to talking about how to craft effective policy recommendations. Here are some key characteristics of a good recommendation. So a good recommendation is evidence-informed, specific, and actionable, and directed at the decision-making authority that can implement the change. Amy's going to say more about that. And then is also realistic within the policy landscape. So on that note, I'm going to turn it back over to Amy Rowling-McGee, who's going to say more about the policy landscape.
All right, so this is Amy Rowling-McGee again. Just going to review a few slides, and then we're going to have a conversation with former Senator Shannon Jones about what the policymaking environment is like here in Ohio right now. We thought it was important to talk a little bit about the current policy landscape and how that may impact the way this final report is received in our General Assembly and also by the executive branch of government as well. A reminder that policy can be made at the federal level, at the state level, or at the local level. For this particular project, and also for much of the Health Policy Institute of Ohio's work, we're primarily focusing on the state level. However, in some cases, we might find that we also need to make policy recommendations for the local level because some key decisions related to transportation and housing, for example, are made at the local or regional level. At the state level, policy can be made and implemented at the legislative, executive, or judicial level. For this project, we'll be focusing primarily on the legislative and executive levels. So here you see a diagram of what that includes. For the legislative branch, that would include members of the Ohio Senate and the Ohio General Assembly. There are 132 people who serve in our General Assembly, and then the executive branch of government, which is led by Governor John Kasich, and then all of the state agencies that report up through the governor. The House leadership is currently comprised of Speaker Cliff Rosenberger, and then also Representative Fred Strayhorn, who is the minority leader. You can see here there are 66 Republican House members and 33 Democratic House members. And the Senate is led by Senator Larry Obhoff, who is the president of the Senate, and the minority leader is Senator Kenny Yuko. There are 24 Republicans in the Ohio Senate and 9 Democrats. All right, so now we're going to turn to a few questions for Senator Jones, former Senator Jones, and we'll also invite you to ask questions in the chat box on the webinar screen. So Shannon, are you there?
I am.
All right, well, thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Sure, happy to.
I'll acknowledge too that you are a member of this advisory group as well. So you'll be participating in the process as we move forward with crafting policy recommendation. But we really wanted to start, it's important, we think, to develop and offer realistic policy recommendations as a part of this project. So we're wondering if you could describe the most important characteristics of the current General Assembly, things like Well, like leadership, what I just reviewed, any other dynamics, the election cycle, hot button issues, et cetera, that we need to keep in mind as an advisory group as we prepare the final report.
Yeah, I would first of all say that you did a really good summary in terms of laying out what the political party representation is, because in this state where you have not only the Republicans controlling the House and the Senate, they also do so by supermajorities. And in this case, obviously, Governor Kasich is also a Republican. So given such strong Republican majorities, I think, that's a lens by which you have to evaluate things, because, they dictate what the what the priorities are going to be, at least between now and, the next statewide election, and House and Senate election, which is next year. So the remainder of this General Assembly is pretty much set. So not only are they Republicans, but I think, at least in my tenure there, the chambers have gotten to be more conservative Republicans. And so we've seen that reflected in the conversations around the Group 8 Medicaid expansion population policy debate. You can also see it as recently in the most recent budget deliberations, where the legislature has made some choices to attempt to override the governor's veto of some policy considerations. So I think those things are really relevant as you're thinking about the likelihood of a strong Republican, even a conservative Republican dominated body to take up the mantle of the policy recommendations that you put forward.
And I'm wondering, just to follow up on that a little bit too, if you could talk a bit about the leadership issues that are going to be emerging or are currently emerging in both the House and then the Senate as leadership transitions, and how we might want to keep that in mind too as we move forward.
Yeah, so the House, I think, is where the most significant changeover or opportunity is, because of term limits and where members of the existing leadership are in their tenure. You're going to see the existing Speaker of the House being termed out, and so there will be a battle for who's going to be the next Speaker. And the Speaker has a lot of influence in determining priorities within a caucus. And so, while externally you can't really do anything to change, to influence that, and probably shouldn't do anything to try to influence that, it is going to, there is going to be some kind of more relevance along the ideologies within the caucuses as they seek to choose who's going to be the next leader of the caucus. So, that's going to be a little harder to predict.
Mm-hmm.
In the Senate, there's going to be less turnover in the Senate, although I think it's important to note that Senator Gail Manning, who is somebody who is really instrumental in a lot of the work that chamber did on infant mortality reduction, she will be term limited. And so that will be opening up, some position in the leadership level, and she's in the number 4 spot. The same is true for the sitting finance chairman, Senator Scott Olslager. So he will be term limited, and then the Senate president will select a new finance chair for the next General Assembly. But in terms of stability within the caucus, the Senate, because the Senate president and most of his team will be returning, that's kind of a less volatile body.
I think that's really helpful for us to keep in mind, in particular in the House, because, I mean, while there is a strong majority of Republicans in that body, there's a wide variety of perspectives even
Mm-hmm.
within that. That's not a uniform body by any stretch of the imagination. And I think it's important for us to know what that overall dynamic is regarding the leadership shifts, because there's alliances being formed. And while we might have a conversation that seems promising with one legislator one day, you find out later that they're really in the minority of the majority, and that
Right.
might not be as promising as it seems.
Right. And you can even see how that's you're kind of seeing the different, I hate to use the word factions, but the different sort of perspectives are showing themselves. So just yesterday, one of the House committees voted out a bill that an anti-vaccine bill. And then this morning, the speaker has said, well, we think we maybe need to refer that to a new committee to have some different types of conversations. So you don't see that happen too often, but I think you're seeing it more frequently as the sort of caucuses have a variety of perspectives within them.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Now, I'd like for you to think back on the recommendations that came from the Legislative Commission on Infant Mortality report, the report that led to the legislation you sponsored and then to the creation of this advisory group. But thinking back on that report and the work that went into the report, what types of policy recommendations in that were most effective, and why do you think they were effective?
So the things that we were looking at the commission, much as you all have outlined already in this presentation and pretty much throughout the process, is wanting to focus on evidence-based interventions. And so I think the use of evidence to inform policy is really, really critical. However, I think what the commission really tried to distinguish between are those things that were programmatic that may be successful because of a particular leader in a particular community, and those things that were systemic. So those things that were that you could scale and could replicate in other areas because the model was about a system change and not a particular program. And so I think a lot of times in this work that when there's focus on provincial programs like that, they are less successful than when you focus on the evidence-based, protocols or models that are scalable and can be replicated and can be adapted given the local community's needs. And so we try to be very mindful of that. The third thing that I was particularly mindful of was sort of the political dynamics that you were talking about earlier. And so, as we all know who've been active in this work, that smoking, for example, is a huge driver And one of the things that throughout my tenure in the General Assembly, both in the House and the Senate, that I fought for was, changes in tax policy in order to deter smoking. But that in 10 years, I'd never been able to get, the will to do something on that. And while I thought that was a really important issue because the evidence told us that was a really important issue, we chose to include it in the report because the evidence was so overwhelming. But in crafting the legislation that implemented many of the recommendations, I made the decision to not include that recommendation. And so sometimes you have to make recommendations even knowing they're not likely to get adapted, but it should never be an all or nothing proposition, because the vast majority of the recommendations that we put forward were those which the evidence were sound, the support was there, and it paved, the way for there to be consensus and support to get something done.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, what was effective was the focus on evidence-based strategies, the focus on systemic opportunities, acknowledging that that there needed to be realistic policy recommendations in the report, but then also acknowledging that there could be a few things in the report that were kind of stretch goals, possibly weren't going to happen immediately, but still needed to be there nevertheless, given their importance and relevance.
That's exactly right. You said it way better than I did.
I think you said it quite well in the first place. But okay, so let's talk some about social determinants like housing and transportation. These issues, as you know, because you've heard quite a lot of testimony related to all of these issues, and infant mortality is very complex, and the connections are not always obvious or direct. What suggestions do you have for us? And I guess by us, I don't mean just HPIO, but I mean all of the folks who are participating in the advisory group who will also be carrying forward these recommendations after this project has concluded. What advice or suggestions do you have for all of us and how we communicate those connections in a way that policymakers will understand and be motivated to act upon? And if there are like certain words that you think just don't resonate with certain audiences, jargon that you think is difficult for other people to get their head around, like folks in the legislature to get their head around, that would be helpful to know too.
Yeah, so, I am not an expert on language, but I am experienced, at least, in trying to communicate with a variety of people who have different experiences and different backgrounds, and I understand at least how important language is. So I mainly learn these things through trial and error, where I've put my foot in my mouth and I didn't intend to do it. So, my experience is that when you're dealing largely with Republican audiences, who are the ones that control the agenda. So again, the objective is to get on the agenda and to become a priority on the agenda. Is that for Republican audiences, I found that when you use words like justice or racism, they have certain connotations to them. That doesn't mean they're not appropriate words. It's that sometimes we have to choose different words to communicate the same meaning. And so when I began talking about infant mortality, I knew that, for example, that we had to talk about the racial inequity that existed. And so you couldn't have an honest conversation without, talking about the very real gap that existed. But you know, by the same token, we had to balance the need to raise what could be a sensitive issue for folks. We had to balance it with things that people could kind of grab onto that didn't, you know, sort of challenge their view of the world. So, for example, we knew that right out of the gate we needed to develop some consensus and rally people around the cause through things that didn't seem controversial. So things like developing an awareness month around infant mortality, doing some safe sleep education and policy work, because that while it seems like it's the low-hanging fruit, it is the low-hanging fruit, but through that process, you are able to educate policymakers, develop trust, and that trust allows you to talk about more and more controversial issues as time goes on. And so I think just understanding the timing of things, as well as looking for opportunities to build rapport and trust on kind of more tangible solutions, those really help you with the more difficult conversations. The last thing I would add about this is that, you know, there's always a tendency to say, okay, we know transportation's a problem, and so we want to fix this entire transportation system, and we bite off, you know, we've got to fix transportation, and we've got to fix education, and it can be overwhelming. I think the reason why we wanted to have these facilitated conversations that you're doing is because we need to really break it down and say, okay, we acknowledge that our transportation system is really, you know, under-resourced and, you know, antiquated, and we have all kinds of challenges here. But this one piece of the system, if we did this, it would have the effect of impacting, you know, these hotspot areas. You know, whatever it is, it's like Rome wasn't built in a day. So what are the things that we can do, not so much quickly, but tangibly, that can start moving the dial?
Well, you've already touched on issues related to disparities in infant mortality rates. We know that racism, discrimination, these historical inequities are the driving forces behind many of the social determinant factors that impact infant mortality, in particular Black infant mortality. We're wondering what suggestions you have for how we should communicate these issues in the report in a way that policymakers will understand and, again, be motivated to act upon.
Yeah, I mean, look, these are really tough issues. We all know that. That's why we're in this situation that we're in. So I think a lot of it has to do with the style over the substance. So for me, really relying on the facts about, you know, what are the key facts that you want people to know about the inequity, and what your, you know, proposal does to address that gap. You know, if you're trying to get people to solve institutional racism, that is a completely overwhelming, and you're going to be hitting people at different experiences and at different levels of acceptance of what we believe is the fact. But if we talk to them about, here's what the data tells us the gap is, and here is one way where we can address this gap to lower the infant mortality rate, I think people are more open to that. So, you know, we've come a long way in the last few years in introducing this conversation to many of the policymakers who are still there today. So I think, you know, not everybody this isn't going to be new information for everybody. but for some people it will be new information. And so kind of understanding that piece of it, just will serve you in the long run. I guess I always had to think about this. What am I trying to do? Am I trying to be right, or am I trying to move the ball? And so I'm always going to err on the side of moving the ball and let others determine what's right, because I can't change people's motivations. I can only change their votes, or influence their votes, or get them to consider different kinds of information.
Well, and we definitely see evidence of the impact of your work and the work of others who've been talking to other legislators about this topic. We've had several meetings with legislators in the last 6-9 months or so who are very eager to work on racial and ethnic disparities related to infant mortality. So that's been very encouraging, and I want you to know that your work and the work of others is continuing in that respect. I guess one question, I mean, you might have already sort of answered this question, and this is kind of a more personal question, but I mean, you've taken on some like really challenging issues over the course of your legislative career. You've had protesters in front of your house, like it's gotten personal for you. And I'm just wondering, like, how do you manage that? Because I mean, these conversations are really hard to have, and things can get kind of seemingly worse before they get better.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how you've stayed centered throughout your legislative career when those kinds of situations have presented themselves.
I love that this is being recorded and archived forever. So it's like Deep Thoughts by Shannon Jones. Like anybody, but the reality is there are some days I did it better than other days. There are plenty of times that I look back on an individual meeting, or an individual vote, or an individual issue, or an individual conversation, and I wish I could take it back and do it, because I would do it differently. So that's a part of life. We live and learn from those experiences. But what I came to appreciate from being in the legislature is, when I think most policymakers, regardless of what their experience is, and regardless of where they come from or what party they're from, they do care about what the facts tell them. And so the times when I did not allow my emotions to get in front of the facts, and was able to really have an honest conversation about the facts, were the times when I was more successful. That doesn't mean that I was not passionate about the issue that I was talking about, but I had to be prepared to consider that I wasn't always right, and that other people had other experiences that were also valid. And so when I was more aware of the considerations that other people had, the more successful I was. And so, the truth is, when I first started talking to my colleagues about the racial inequity that exists in our birth outcomes, a lot of folks just didn't believe it. It's not because they're bad people. It's not because I wasn't providing them with the evidence. It was so mind-blowing to them that their mind couldn't grasp it. And so I had to give them time to kind of catch up. Because how arrogant would it be for me, who for 6 or 7 years previously, I heard other colleagues of mine talk about this very same inequity, and I could never wrap my head around it. And so because I had that experience, and for me, a little bit of shame about that, I had to provide the grace to allow people to catch up too. And so, these are tough issues. We all have different experiences. And, you know, when you have different constituencies you have to answer to, they may not always be the, you know, the top priority for an individual policymaker, and that's okay. You know, we've got to give everybody the room to do what they need to do in the way they need to do it. But at the same time, you have to be really focused on, okay, what are you really trying to get accomplished here? So it's balancing, you know, it's hard because I just wanted everybody to do what I told them to do because I knew the evidence was right, and I wanted them to trust me because I was telling them that was the case. But, you know, life doesn't work that way. If it was a legislature of one, it would have been great, but that's not the way it works. And so the practical side really has to humble the ego here as you're trying to advance really tough conversations.
Well, your humility and your honesty is refreshing, and we thank you for that. I'm going to ask if there are any questions from participants on the call, but while we're waiting for folks to queue up and see if there are any questions, I'm going to ask one final question of you. We're going to have a gubernatorial election in 2018. What thoughts do you have about how we might think about that transition? Because this report will be coming out the end of what year are we in? 2017. And then, you know, almost a year later, there will be this election. So realistically, if we're successful in getting some momentum related to some of these recommendations actually moving forward, that may be carried forward by the next administration. What work do you think we should all be engaged in next year, I guess, as we go into the election season regarding these recommendations?
Yeah, so I think that this is always about relationship building and looking for the opportunities to be developing relationships with all of the candidates out there and sharing your story. The great thing about the committees that you've put together here and this process you've laid out is folks are coming from all over the state, and they have their own networks and their own coalitions, and many of them are engaged in, you know, real collaborative work to try to address this issue. And so, you know, much like they developed relationships over time with members of the General Assembly, they have to think about now, how do we develop relationships with all, you know, of the candidates? And, you know, while this campaign is going to be here before we know it, come May, it'll be down to 2 candidates. And so that's an easier number to manage towards. So, you know, nobody knows who's gonna be the nominees for the various parties, but I think come May, local communities need to be in a position to be able to really reach out and have some consensus around the 1 or 2 points they're really trying to communicate to the executive.
All right, thank you. I don't see any questions from participants, so I think we'll conclude this portion of the meeting. Once again, we really thank you for sharing your insights on the call. Wait, a question just came in. All right. Okay, the question is, do you worry that there could be general exhaustion on the topic of infant mortality? That, you know, this has been a topic of conversation for a long time. Do you think that there may be some people who are interested in moving on and talking about other challenges?
I don't think it's exhaustion. I think I am worried whenever you lose any advocates internally on who's going to pick up the mantle of the work. And so since there's not been any direct issues on it, it's unclear to me who might really lean in on these questions. And I think it's typical with a lot of issues, especially when you're dealing with folks who do this work every day. You think everybody knows about it and everybody's talking about it and everybody's tired of hearing about it. When the truth of the matter is that outside of the meetings you go to, most people still, no matter how hard you're working, still are relatively unaware of the challenge ahead of us. That's not to say that there aren't going to be some members who think, well, we already solved that problem because we passed Senate Bill 332 and, you know, some other bills prior to 332, and we have this commission. You're always going to have that. But, you know, what's the choice? You can't, you know, it's a false choice to say, well, gee, we should probably talk about something else, because then that something else there would be some limited fatigue about as well. So, you know, this is a business about the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and that with term limits and with limited attention span and with so many big issues the state is trying to focus, that would not be my worry. My worry is trying to find, you know, strong champions in both chambers, particularly in the majority party, who are willing to make this one of their key priorities and kind of drive it home. Because in the absence of the champions to do it, you become victim to, well, we've already done that and I'm tired of talking about it. But when you have real champions in there, it doesn't matter if you're tired of talking about it, you're being forced to because it's on the agenda. Does that make sense?
I think that it makes complete sense. And it actually reminds me of something else that I've heard you say many times, which is just putting out a report doesn't do anything. And I don't think that you intend that as criticism. You intend it to be more of a call to action, that in this report that we'll produce in early December, it's not like the end
Yeah.
of conversations around social determinants of infant mortality. It'll be a continuation, and hopefully will be helpful to others who have for a long time been working on this. In fact, we're, you know, the people who are championing it through the Commission on Infant Mortality and on the deliberations regarding the bill, and that strong advocacy work will need to continue, and perhaps even, you know, be more strategic in terms of focusing on some of the policy recommendations that come out of this process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the report is really as hard as this process is to get to the report, it's kind of the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Because then you have to find avenues to share the report, spread the report, get people to focus on the report, and you know, find champions from within who are willing to accept one or two things in the report. And you know, it'll be different things for different people, but you know, without that, my office was full of reports where nothing was ever acted on. It didn't mean the work was not any good. It was probably very good. It was that there's so many issues and so much information and so many competing interests and priorities. You have to sort of figure out what are the avenues to kind of get people's attention. And you don't need everybody, but you need a couple of key, you know, influencers who are going to make it a priority.
Okay, well, thank you again for sharing all your thoughts with us today. We'll look forward to continuing this work with you.
Great, thank you.
Okay, now I'm going to hand it off to Haley Aka for the next portion of our agenda.
All right, thank you very much, Amy, and to Shannon, thanks for kind of that deep dive into Ohio's current policy environment. I'm going to now take us a step back and think about some of the general ways we can create effective policy recommendations. So policymakers have different actions they can take, also known as policy levers, that influence behavior or change economic and social conditions. And policy recommendations are really most effective when they're specific about which policy lever should be pulled in a given circumstance. So we're going to look at some of those policy levers right now, as well as some example policy recommendations from previous briefs and reports that will show some of the range of policy recommendations available to this group as we move forward. So here's a list of some types of policy levers. And here we've included taxes, fees, and disincentives, subsidies and incentives, budgets, grants, contracts, and other financing mechanisms. And then we have this large set of policy levers called regulations. And some types of regulations are setting standards and requirements, monitoring and evaluation, enforcing existing regulations, and then even deregulation. And then policymakers also have the ability to inform and educate through the policymaking process. So looking at some examples of policy recommendations that relate to these things. This first one, and just to remind us again, these are policy recommendations that come from previous briefs and reports just to serve as an example of how to tie to some of these key policy levers. So this first recommendation pulls on the taxes, fees, and disincentives lever, and it suggests that the legislature increase the tobacco tax and use the revenues for policies and programs aimed at reducing infant mortality. I think this is one that Shannon referred to earlier during her portion. And so this is just a pretty standard tax and spend sort of recommendation. In this example on this slide, we have two different recommendations, both in the budget and financing category, and this is to show some of the range of policy options with this lever. So in this first recommendation, it asks the legislature to allocate direct funding to school-based health centers through specific funding streams. And so this is kind of a new funding source. Increasing a funding source would look like a similar sort of recommendation. The second example here suggests that the Ohio Department of Health fund a program based on outcomes rather than processes. So this is a change in the way that a currently funded program will be funded in the future. And so policymakers can influence agency and program financing in a wide variety of ways, and policy recommendations can be broad enough to reflect that. Okay, in this example, we have a policy recommendation that suggests the inclusion of a program requirement, which is a type of regulatory action that policymakers could take. So in that large group of regulatory policy levers, we have requirements, and in this one specifically, we're looking at a data sharing requirement between state agencies. Just one of many possibilities. And in this last example, we have a recommendation that relates to monitoring and evaluation. And here it suggests that a state agency should evaluate a set of objectives and report the evaluation findings to the legislature. Monitoring and evaluation is a really important policy lever that sometimes is missed in the policymaking process. So this can be a very helpful sort of recommendation to make. And so with that sort of overview of policy levers and recommendations that connect, I'm going to pass the presentation back to Amy Stevens, who's going to talk about the role of research evidence in developing recommendations.
Thank you, Haley. So you heard Senator Jones talk about the importance of facts and evidence, and I'm going to talk about how we are using and will be using evidence to inform the findings and recommendations in this report. So the recommendations will be informed by these sources. So we'll have an inventory of evidence-based policies and programs, and here we're building from existing evidence registries and systematic reviews. So a lot of work that's already been done by national organizations. Also be informed by the literature reviews that we discussed at the advisory committee meeting last week. They'll also be informed by what we learn from the other states, so those lessons learned from those 8 case study states, and then suggestions and priorities from all of you. Throughout this project, we'll be relying heavily on research-based evidence, so that's the results of scientific studies, but of course that's only one kind of evidence that we use in our decision making. Experiential and contextual evidence are also important, especially given the gaps in the research literature related to the social determinants of health and infant mortality. So experiential evidence is your experience in practice and your own lived experience that you bring to this process as a member of the advisory group. And then also contextual evidence is information about feasibility, cultural appropriateness, and political climate. So that conversation that we just had was really with Shannon Jones was an example of bringing contextual evidence to the process. As we think about these sources that will inform the policy recommendations, the top two are really where we're bringing in the research-based evidence, and the bottom two rely on all three sources of evidence, including experiential and contextual. We're currently pulling together the evidence inventories, drawing in particular from these systematic reviews and evidence registries. And if you participated with us on the development of the State Health Improvement Plan, this process will look pretty familiar. These are just two examples of the inventories that we're working on for transportation and housing. So really digging into those very specific policies and programs here related to transportation and housing. So getting very concrete. And we'll be providing these inventories to you before the October 17th meeting so that you can draw upon them as we think about recommendations. So now let's put together the information that Haley presented about policy levers with what I just said about research evidence. And so this slide summarizes how we put these things together to develop policy recommendations. And here's an example of what I mean by that, looking at transportation. So strengthening access to public transportation is an evidence-based policy from the evidence inventory, but just sort of vaguely saying we need to strengthen Ohio's public transportation system would probably not be very impactful. And so here you can see the much more specific language that we've come up with that is directed. The first two are directed at state policymakers and are recommendations related to funding streams from the state to local entities to support bus systems. And then there are also some recommendations here for the local level for transit authorities, since of course many decisions about bus systems are made at the local level by transit authorities. And then here are a few examples from housing. And the first two here are for state policymakers, and they're focused on increasing the supply of affordable housing for renters with extremely low incomes. So those are just a few examples of the types of recommendations that we're working towards, and you can see that they really are as specific as we can make them. If this call has inspired you to think of some specific recommendations related to housing, transportation, education, or employment, we encourage you to send those along as you think of them, and if you have contacts you can reach out to who can help with crafting some of these recommendations, that would be great. We'll also be asking for your input at the October 17th meeting, but if you think of something before then, please send it along. And we will be sending out an email before the 17th meeting with some pre-reads and posting some materials on the webpage so that you can be ready for those conversations. And we have plenty of time to take some questions or comments. So thinking forward, really the purpose of this call today was to lay the groundwork so that we'll be ready for the October 17th meeting to really start crafting and prioritizing those policy recommendations. Let us know if there's other information that would be helpful for you to be ready for that process. I wish we had some music we could play. I'm not going to sing. All right, any questions or comments? I'm not seeing any. But as always, you have my email address, so please feel free to reach out and let us know any suggestions or questions you have. Oh, here we go. T21, tobacco 21 is a policy worth considering. So I think tobacco 21 is certainly a good example of an evidence-based strategy. In this report, we're going to be focusing primarily on housing, transportation, education, and employment, and those cross-cutting factors that we had on that diagram. And so tobacco is not one of the areas that we're going to be focusing on for policy recommendations, but of course we'll mention the role of tobacco use as a risk factor for infant mortality in the intro section. Makes sense? All right. We have lots of other publications that talk about recommendations for tobacco policy. So we're always happy to talk about tobacco policy. In fact, we have a forum coming up next week. Or what's the date of the forum? The 26th. We'll be talking about tobacco policy and also drug addiction policy. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions or comments. Thank you so much for joining us today. Looks like we have a good group. The slides are already posted and one more, comment on housing. We find that there are local codes that prevent safe and affordable housing. Are there plans to address policy at the local level? So this is definitely something that we've been running into in terms of housing and transportation in particular, is that many of the decisions are made at the local level. So we will consider local recommendations, particularly when there's something that the state can do to allow, incentivize, or require action at the local level or support action at the local level. Obviously, we can't get into like very, very specific local level policies for, the city of Toledo or for the city of Columbus, but I think we need to be open to considering policy levers and decision makers at the local level. And then another question, did you assemble a collection of best policies from other states that we interviewed that we may want to consider? Yeah, as we're talking to folks in the 8 states, we're asking them to share what types of interventions, policies, and programs they've implemented, and so we'll highlight those, and some of them will go into more detail than others, but that'll definitely be part of that section of the report. All right. Thanks again for joining us, and you will hear from me within the next few weeks, and we hope to see you on October 17th at a fabulous location to be determined soon. Have a great rest of your week. Thanks.